February 22nd, 1956, 2:17 a.m. Altklinke American sector, Berlin. The air is cold and thick with the smell of smelleth and machine oil. The only light comes from a string of bare bulbs, casting long, wavering shadows against the rough-hewn timber walls. In a chamber 11 feet beneath a quiet German street, the silence is absolute. It is not the silence of absence, but of intense, focused listening. A U.S. Army technician, his shirt sleeves rolled up, slowly adjusts a dial on a large, gray recording unit. Reels of 1-inch magnetic tape spin silently, capturing nothing but a faint electronic hiss. His eyes are fixed on a bank of oscilloscopes, their green luminescent traces dancing to a secret rhythm. The lines pulse and jump, not with random static, but with the organized, modulated waveforms of human communication. These are the vital signs of the Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst, transmitted through 3 massive underground cables just inches above the technician's head. For 11 months and 11 days, this chamber and the meticulously engineered tunnel, stretching 1,476 feet from it, directly beneath the Soviet sector border, has been the West's most audacious ear. It has harvested a river of Soviet and East German military and diplomatic secrets. But tonight, the oscilloscope trays spike violently. From above, through layers of soil and concrete, comes a new sound. Not the hum of electrons, but the unmistakable physical thud of boots. Heavy, deliberate, they are directly overhead. The technician freezes, his hand hovering over the dial. The carefully constructed silence of the tunnel shatters, not from within, but from the world above they have sought to evade. The listening post has, it seems, become the listened to. The era of perfect secrecy is ending with the crunch of a Soviet trenching tool piercing the tunnel's roof. Yet, for over a year, Soviet command had been utterly powerless, their most sensitive communications laid bare to their enemies, a vulnerability born not in the skies or space, but in the cold, dark earth of a divided city. Berlin in the early 1950s was a city of ghosts and mirrors. Physically shattered by war, it was now psychologically cleaved by the nascent Cold War. The Berlin airlift of 1948-49 had been an overt, heroic struggle for survival. But in its shadow, a far more clandestine war had taken root. The four-power occupation American, British, French, and Soviet transformed the city into the densest espionage arena on Earth. Streets were borders. A wrong turn could land an agent in a rival sector. Trust was a currency with no buyers. For Western intelligence, particularly the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and its signals intelligence partner, the National Security Agency, NSA, this environment was one of profound frustration. The Soviet military and political apparatus in East Germany, headquartered at the sprawling compound in Karlshorst, was a black box. Human intelligence, HUMINT, was perilous and unreliable. The KGB's Staatssicherheitsdienst, or Stasi, was weaving an ever tighter web of surveillance and informants. Defectors were rare, and their information often dated or deliberately seeded with disinformation. Overflights by reconnaissance aircraft like the RAF's Canberra or the soon-to-deploy U-2 were high risk, providing photographs of buildings, not the conversations inside them. The primary Soviet means of secure long-distance communication with Moscow, with its military groups across Eastern Europe, and with its diplomatic outposts, was the landline. In an age before satellite communications and widespread, reliable encryption, physical cables were the backbone of command. The Soviets, logically, used the existing German civilian telecommunications infrastructure. 3 major cable bundles, buried along predictable routes, carried this torrent of classified traffic. They ran from the Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst through the heart of East Berlin, and then, critically, for a short but decisive stretch, through the American sector of Berlin at Altklinke, before continuing deeper into East German territory and onward to Moscow. This geographical quirk was the result of Berlin's haphazard, pre-war telephone grid and the arbitrary zonal divisions drawn by the Allies in 1945. To the Soviet Signal Corps, It was a minor logistical inconvenience. To a small group of American and British intelligence officers staring at cable maps in 1951, it was a potential godsend. The cables were vulnerable. They were tangible. They passed through soil controlled, at least for a few hundred meters, by the United States. Tapping them wasn't a matter of breaking a code. It was a matter of reaching the physical wire. The problem was physics and audacity, not just cryptography. The strategic imperative was clear. The Korean War, raging since 1950, had convinced Washington that direct conventional conflict with the Soviet Union was a possibility. Understanding Soviet intentions, their military readiness in Europe, and the loyalty of their Warsaw Pact satellites was paramount. The cables at Alt-Glienicke promised a direct feed into the nervous system of the Soviet military command in Europe. They carried not only encrypted high-level communications, but, analysts suspected, a wealth of plain text administrative and logistical traffic, the mundane yet revealing chatter of a massive army going about its daily business. This was the context: a desperate need for insight, a glaring vulnerability in the enemy's armor, and a city whose divided chaos provided the perfect camouflage for an operation of staggering scale. The concept of tapping the Soviet cables did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the direct, albeit far ambitious, descendant of a recent success. In the closing days of World War II in Vienna, British intelligence had executed Operation Silver. They had tunneled into the basement of a house to tap the underground telephone cables used by the Soviet occupation forces. The yield had been significant, proving the fundamental viability of the method. But Vienna was not Berlin. The scale of the Berlin operation would need to be exponentially larger, deeper, and more technically sophisticated to target the heavily guarded, high-capacity trunk lines serving the Soviet High Command. The man who would become the driving force behind the Berlin iteration was William "Bill King" Harvey, a former FBI agent who had moved to the CIA. Portly, hard-drinking, and possessed of a relentless, paranoid energy, Harvey was a figure straight from a Le Carré novel. He was tasked with leading the CIA's International Communism Division, and he saw in the Berlin cable maps not just an opportunity, but an imperative. He christened the undertaking Project Gold, sometimes referred to by its CIA cryptonym, PB jointly. Harvey understood that the CIA lacked the specific technical expertise for such a monumental task. He needed a partner. That partner was Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Specifically, he needed the knowledge of the London Signals Intelligence Board and the brilliant, eccentric minds at the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. The British brought to the table not only the lessons from Vienna, but also a cadre of engineers and listeners from the Royal Corps of Signals who had honed their craft against the Nazis. A formal agreement was struck. The CIA would provide the bulk of the funding, manpower, and on-the-ground logistics in Berlin. MI6 and GCHQ would provide the core technical planning, the tapping expertise, and would share in the intelligence harvest. It was a rare and profound act of transatlantic trust in the shadowy world of intelligence. The operational plan was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. It called for the construction of a shallow, vertical shaft in the basement of a radar warehouse at a site code named A in the American sector at Alt-Glienicke. From there, a horizontal tunnel would be driven 1,476 feet over a quarter of a mile eastward, passing directly beneath the border between the American and Soviet sectors. The terminus would be a precisely calculated chamber directly beneath the 3 Soviet cable bundles. The depth, soil composition, and need for absolute silence dictated every detail. The tunnel could not sag or shift, lest it create detectable subsidence on the street above. It had to be ventilated, heated to prevent condensation from damaging equipment, and reinforced against collapse. Most critically, it had to be acoustically silent. The sound of digging or machinery could not reach the surface, just meters away in the Soviet sector. To mask the massive excavation, the CIA constructed a false front. The warehouse at Site A became a supposed headquarters for the U.S. Army's 701st Military Intelligence Group. Fences went up, guards were posted, and trucks rolled in and out carrying ostensibly mundane supplies. In reality, they were removing thousands of tons of excavated earth, which was secretly dumped into a nearby lake. The engineering was entrusted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with cover stories so tight that most of the soldiers involved believed they were building a secure underground storage facility or a command post. The target was unequivocal: the 3 Moscow-Leipzig cables. Intelligence suggested Cable 1 carried high-level military and diplomatic traffic. Cable 2 was for medium-priority military communications. Cable 3 was believed to be the internal line for the East German security services and Communist Party. Tapping into this triad would give the West an unprecedented, real-time window into the Soviet order of battle, its logistical frailties, its political directives from Moscow, and the tensions within the Eastern Bloc. It was a bid to replace guesswork with hard data, paranoia with protocol. By late 1953, the plans were complete. The warehouse was secured. The first shovels stood ready. The mission was to bury a listening post into the heart of the enemy's domain, a steel and concrete ear pressed against the wall of the Soviet Empire. This establishes the strategic need, the alliance, and the monumental engineering challenge. Beneath the veneer of high-stakes espionage, Project Gold was, for hundreds of days, a monumental feat of manual labor and lonely vigilance. The men who built and manned the tunnel were not the dashing spies of fiction. They were soldiers, engineers, technicians, and linguists operating in a claustrophobic, perpetual twilight. The digging itself was a study in controlled strain. Teams of U.S. Army engineers, working in suffocating 8-hour shifts, advanced the tunnel face at a rate of about 5 feet per day. They used modified mining equipment with muffled engines, their progress measured in inches of hard-packed Berlin sand and clay. The tunnel was a masterpiece of utilitarian design. A 6-foot-high, 4-foot-wide steel tube composed of interchangeable segmented liners. Each section was hauled into place by a small, silent electric railway that ran the tunnel's length. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, hydraulic fluid, and sweat, constantly scrubbed and circulated by a massive, silenced ventilation system that also maintained a slight positive pressure to keep out groundwater. The greatest fear was not discovery but collapse, a ton of Soviet sector soil burying men in secret in an unmarked grave. Parallel to the diggers were the listeners. Before a single tap was placed, a critical psychological operation began. At a remote site, technicians built a full-scale mock-up of the proposed tap chamber. Here, they practiced the final, most delicate act, exposing the lead sheathing of the Soviet cables, attaching the taps, and connecting them to the amplifier lines that would snake back to the recording room at Site A. They rehearsed in total darkness, by feel alone, until the procedure was muscle memory. The margin for error was zero. A single slip, a telltale scrape, could alert Soviet line monitoring equipment. Once the tunnel became operational in May 1955, a new breed of inhabitant took over: the translators and analysts. Housed in a specially constructed, soundproofed building above the warehouse, they lived in a bizarre duality. They walked in the sunlight of the American sector, bought groceries, visited pubs. Then they descended into the earth to eavesdrop on a world that was geographically a stone's throw away, yet ideologically on another planet. Their works was a bank of 430 Tampx tape recorders, each automatically activated by a VU meter detecting activity on one of the tapped lines. The tapes ran for 24 hours a day, producing over 1,200 reels weekly. The psychological weight was immense. These linguists, many of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, spent their days transcribing the mundane yet intimate details of Soviet military life. A colonel complaining about the quality of boots issued to his conscripts, a logistics officer arranging a shipment of fuel, the homesick chatter of a teletype operator. They heard the bureaucratic friction between the Soviet army and the East German Stasi. They documented the size, the frustrations, the human frailties within a system portrayed as monolithic. For them, the enemy became human, not through defection, but through the disembodied wire. The isolation was profound. They could never discuss their work, even amongst themselves outside the secured vault. They carried the secret of the tunnel in silence, knowing that the street above their heads was, for hundreds of feet, technically hostile territory. They were ghosts in a machine, translating the secrets of one empire for the benefit of another, from a room that officially did not exist. Their existence was the operation's core paradox. To maintain the tunnel's secrecy, they had to become part of the silence it was designed to break. Every cough, every dropped tool, every conversation in the tap chamber was a potential breach. They lived with the constant low-grade dread that the next sound from the overhead cables wouldn't be a Russian voice, but the crunch of excavation from above, a sound they trained for but hoped never to hear. The tunnel was not just an engineering project, it was a state of mind, a prolonged exercise in controlled anxiety conducted in a steel tube beneath the frozen front of the Cold War. In an era before satellite interception and digital packet sniffing, the Berlin Tunnel represented the absolute apex of analog espionage. It was a mechanical beast, a Rube Goldberg machine of breathtaking complexity built for one simple, silent purpose: to steal electrons without leaving a trace. Every piece of technology, from the digging equipment to the final recording head, was either custom-built or heavily modified for a single, non-negotiable requirement: operational silence. The primary challenge was the tap itself. The Soviet cables were not simple copper wires. They were heavy-duty, lead-sheathed underground trunk lines, each containing multiple individual circuits. Directly piercing them was impossible. It would cause a detectable drop in line voltage and alert Soviet maintenance monitors. The solution was an ingenious non-invasive technique developed by British GCHQ scientists. It exploited the principle of inductive coupling. In the final, cramped tap chamber, technicians used insulated tools to carefully expose a short section of each cable's lead sheath. They did not cut into the copper conductors inside. Instead, they crafted a precisely fitted ferrite clip, a C-shaped collar that snugly wrapped around the exposed cable. This clip acted as a transformer core. The electromagnetic field generated by the voice currents flowing through the Soviet wires would induce a tiny identical current in a fine coil of wire wrapped around the ferrite. This minute signal, a ghost of the original conversation, was then fed into a bank of vacuum tube amplifiers boosted over 1,000,000 times, and sent down specially shielded lines running along the tunnel wall back to the recording facility at Site A. The process was entirely passive. It drew no power from the Soviet lines, and in theory was undetectable by any known Soviet line testing equipment of the period. It was the electronic equivalent of placing a stethoscope against a vein. The scale of the data harvest demanded a recording system of industrial capacity. This was the domain of the Ampex Model 350 and 375 tape recorders, the workhorses of the operation. Modified to start and stop automatically via voice activation circuits, they ran around the clock. The system was designed to capture everything. But everything presented its own problem. The three cables carried over 172 individual voice and telegraph circuits. Recording all of them simultaneously in high fidelity required not just hundreds of machines, but a revolutionary approach to tape handling. The engineers devised a system where full reels were automatically replaced by fresh ones, with the recorded tapes being boxed and shipped daily under diplomatic cover to London for processing and translation. In total, the tunnel generated approximately 25,000 reels of magnetic tape over its operational life. Environmental control was another silent war. The tunnel and tap chamber had to be maintained at a constant temperature and humidity. Condensation on the cables or the tap apparatus could cause a short, or worse, create a conductive path that might be detected. A complex climate control system, its compressors and fans mounted on rubber vibration dampeners, kept the atmosphere dry and stable. Power for the entire operation was drawn from the American sector grid, but fed through banks of capacitors and regulators to eliminate any telltale electrical noise or surges that might backfeed into the local grid and raise suspicion. Perhaps the most profound technological aspect was what the tunnel didn't have: computers. Analysis was human, painstaking, and slow. Linguists in London, aided by early IBM punch card sorting systems, would index the material. They identified individual voices, code-named them, tracked their posting changes, and built a vast, living organizational chart of the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus in Europe. The technology of the tunnel was not about decryption. It was about capturing the raw, often unencrypted substance of daily communication. It provided context, patterns, and the priceless order of battle intelligence, the locations, strengths, and readiness of Soviet units. The machine listened so that men could understand. It was a deafening roar of information, captured in absolute silence from a hole in the ground. The product of Project Gold was not a single, spectacular revelation. It was a vast, flowing river of mundane detail from which intelligence analysts patiently panned for golden nuggets of strategic insight. For 11 months, the magnetic tape spun, capturing over 50,000 hours of conversations and telegraph transmissions. This torrent of raw data was shipped to a dedicated processing center in London, where a small army of linguists, cryptographers, and analysts from MI6 and GCHQ began the Herculean task of translation, indexing, and interpretation. The immediate prize was the Soviet Order of Battle, Orbat, in Eastern Europe. Before the tunnel, Western military planners relied on estimates, aerial photography, and the occasional defector's report to map the Red Army's disposition. The tunnel provided a real-time administrative feed. Through logistics requests, duty rosters, maintenance reports, and transfer orders, analysts could now paint a precise, dynamic picture. They identified specific divisions, brigades, and regiments. They tracked their locations, their states of readiness, their equipment shortfalls, whether they were missing tanks, had low fuel reserves, or were experiencing outbreaks of disease. They learned the names of commanders, their personalities, and their professional frustrations. This was not abstract intelligence. It was the day-to-day heartbeat of the Soviet military machine in the German Democratic Republic laid bare. For NATO planners, this was priceless. It turned the Soviet threat from a monolithic, unknowable force into a quantified, understandable entity with identifiable strengths and, more importantly, vulnerabilities. Beyond pure military intelligence, the tunnel offered a granular view of the political and security landscape of the Eastern Bloc. The traffic on the lines reserved for the East German Ministry of State Security, the state and the Socialist Unity Party, was particularly revealing. Analysts could measure the paranoia of the East German state, its concerns about popular unrest, its intricate plans for surveillance and control. They documented the deep-seated tensions and mistrust between the Soviet overseers and their East German proxies. The Soviets often treated their allies with paternalistic disdain, while the East German officials resented the occupation while simultaneously depending on it for survival. This friction, detailed in countless petty bureaucratic squabbles, provided the West with a critical understanding of the bloc's internal fractures. One of the most significant confirmations came from the diplomatic and high-level military traffic. While much of this was encrypted, the volume and pattern of the messages themselves were telling. The tunnel allowed Western codebreakers to gather vast quantities of encrypted ciphertext transmitted over landlines, which had a different, cleaner signal profile than radio transmissions. This material was funneled to cryptanalytic efforts, including those at the UK's GCHQ and the USA's NSA, providing grist for their codebreaking mills. Furthermore, not everything was sealed. The Soviets, in their confidence that the buried cables were secure, often sent administrative and logistical material in plain text or with low-level ciphers. These snippets could be cross-referenced with other intelligence helping to build a framework to attack the more complex encryption systems. The human dimension was inescapable. The linguists in London became unwitting biographers of Soviet officers they would never meet. They knew which colonel was having an affair, which major was drinking too much, which supply sergeant was skimming from the stores. They heard the loneliness of conscripts, the careerism of political officers, the weariness of clerks. This human noise was not discarded as chaff. It was analyzed for morale assessments, for understanding the social pressures within the Soviet military, and for identifying potential weak points individuals under stress who might one day be approached as defectors. The tunnel did not just steal secrets, it captured the sigh of an empire. It revealed that behind the formidable facade of the Red Army, there was an organization of tired, grumbling, frustrated individuals bound by ideology and discipline, but far from invincible. This psychological portrait was, in many ways, as valuable as the troop counts. The intelligence windfall was profound, but it was also a double-edged sword. The very volume of the material created a kind of informational intoxication. For the analysts in London and Washington, the tunnel's feed was so rich, so seemingly authoritative, that it risked becoming the sole source of truth. Its secrets were seductive, blinding them to the possibility that the source itself might be compromised, that the river of data could be subtly poisoned at its source. For the entirety of its operational life, the Berlin Tunnel exploited not just a geographical loophole, but a profound psychological and doctrinal blind spot within the Soviet security apparatus. The KGB and its East German subsidiary, the Stasi, were peerless in their domination of the human landscape. They had turned East Germany into a nation of informants. They could intercept letters, bug apartments, and turn a man's closest friends into his jailers. Their strength lay in controlling people. Their weakness, as Project Gold demonstrated, lay in understanding the silent, inanimate infrastructure beneath their feet. Soviet communications security doctrine was rooted in a hierarchy of trust. Radio transmissions were inherently insecure, vulnerable to interception by anyone with a receiver. Therefore, high-level strategic communication relied on landlines, preferably buried cables. The physical cable was seen as a secure medium because it was tangible, owned, and protected by sovereign territory. In their view, to tap it, an enemy would have to physically access it, which would require either a visible excavation on Soviet-controlled soil or a compromised insider within the signal corps. Both scenarios were considered highly detectable. The Earth itself was their shield. This was a catastrophic failure of imagination. They could not conceive of an adversary investing millions of dollars and years of effort to burrow a quarter-mile from foreign territory. It was an engineering project of such scale and patience that it fell outside DB's operational set, which favored human intelligence, defectors, and electronic eavesdropping on wireless signals. This blind spot was actively reinforced by the CIA's monumental deception effort. The construction site at Alt-Glienicke was a masterpiece of theatrical misdirection. The warehouse complex, ostensibly a routine Army intelligence post, had visible security fences, guards, checkpoints that was just convincing enough to deter casual inquiry but not so overt as to scream secret project. The most brilliant stroke was the installation of a fake missile early warning radar on the site. This was a prop, a collection of antennas and scaffolding, but it served multiple purposes. It explained the heightened security to curious locals or low-level Stasi watchers. It provided a plausible cover for the large power consumption needed for the tunnel's ventilation and recording systems. And most importantly, it created a perfect psychological diversion. Any unusual activity, truck movements at odd hours, or soil disposal could be attributed to the construction and maintenance of this sensitive, but fundamentally uninteresting, radar installation. The Soviets were watching the skies. The Americans were digging through the earth. Furthermore, Western intelligence meticulously managed the handling of the tunnel's product. The golden rule of using a sensitive source was to never act on intelligence in a way that could point back to the source. If a tunnel transcript revealed Soviet awareness of a particular CIA agent, that agent would not be abruptly pulled out. He might be fed false information, or his case officer would manufacture a different reason for his recall. If the tunnel revealed Soviet knowledge of a specific NATO exercise, the exercise would proceed as planned. This sanitization of intelligence was a delicate, constant ballet. It meant sometimes allowing the Soviets a small victory to protect the far greater asset. This discipline reinforced the Soviet belief in the security of their cables. When their counterintelligence operations occasionally succeeded, they saw it as proof of their own prowess, not as a possible leak from a compromised communications line. The Stasi, for all its omniscience in the human realm, also failed at the technical level. Their signal security units were tasked with routine line checks for taps. But their methodology was designed to detect crude, invasive connections, the kind a lone saboteur might make in a telephone exchange basement. The passive, inductive taps used in the tunnel, drawing no power and creating no electrical imbalance, were invisible to their standard testing equipment and procedures. They were listening for a shout in the wire. The tunnel's tap was a whisper below the threshold of hearing. This collective blind spot created the conditions for the tunnel's stunning success. Soviet command in Karlshorst was powerless, not because security services were incompetent, but because they were prisoners of their own doctrinal assumptions. They had fortified the doors and windows of their headquarters, but had never considered that an enemy would spend 2 years quietly digging a tunnel through the foundation. Their trust in the sanctity of the buried cable was absolute, and that absolute trust became their greatest vulnerability. The earth, their shield, had been hollowed out into a listening post, and they remained utterly unaware, their secrets flowing unimpeded into the archives of their enemies until the moment the soil of that shield was finally broken. April 1956. For nearly a year, the rhythm had been mechanical, metronomic. The tape spun, the analysts transcribed, the secret held. Then Berlin's climate intervened. The spring of 1956 was unusually wet. Persistent, heavy rains saturated the sandy soil above the tunnel. The sophisticated French-designed waterproofing and drainage system, a source of immense pride for the engineers, began to betray its limitations. It started not with a flood, but with a seep. Technicians in the tap chamber, the sacred space closest to the Soviet cables, noticed a new sound, the steady, irregular plink of water droplets falling from the overhead timbers into strategically buckets. The air, always carefully climate-controlled, grew heavier, damper. Condensation began to bead on the cold steel of the cable sheaths and the sensitive tap apparatus. This was more than an inconvenience. It was a critical threat. Water could short-circuit the amplifiers, corrupt the tapes, and, in a worst-case scenario, create an electrical pathway that might be detected by Soviet line monitors. The tunnel's climate control systems, already working at capacity, struggled against the invasive damp. The maintenance became a frantic, silent battle. Crews worked in rotations, mopping up pools, laying down additional absorbent mats, and adjusting dehumidifiers. The focus was entirely on preserving the operation. But the water presented another, more insidious danger. It was altering the physical environment of the tunnel itself. The constant moisture was slowly undermining the structural integrity of the surrounding soil and the timber shoring in sections closest to the surface. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the water was doing more than dripping into buckets. It was creating a subtle, shifting weakness in the earth directly above the tunnel's spine. Above ground in the Soviet sector, the same rains were causing routine problems. A section of a dirt service road used by Soviet military vehicles, located directly above tunnel's path, began to develop a persistent, muddy depression. To Soviet Army engineers, this was a simple drainage issue, a nuisance to be fixed. They had no reason to connect the soggy patch of ground to espionage. It was just bad soil. In early 1956, a repair crew was dispatched. Their solution was pragmatic. They would dig down to improve the drainage. The coincidence was catastrophic. The weak spot created by the tunnel's moisture met the Soviet shovels probing from above. On the afternoon of April 21, 1956, a Soviet sapper, his boots caked in mud, thrust his trenching tool into the softened earth. The ground gave way more easily than he expected. The tool sank deep, and when he pulled it back, there was not just wet soil on the blade, but splinters of fresh, milled timber. He had struck the roof of the American tunnel. In that moment, the greatest fear of every technician who had ever worked below was realized. The silent, secret world had been breached by the most mundane of actions, a maintenance dig for a pothole. The Soviet soldier stared at the foreign wood in the Berlin mud. The protocol for such a discovery did not exist, because the scenario was inconceivable. He called over his sergeant. Together, they cleared more soil, exposing not a natural formation, but the unmistakable, manufactured top of a steel-reinforced tunnel liner. The game was up. But what happened next was not a furious, immediate assault. There was no storming of the tunnel. Instead, there was a pause, a deliberate, calculated silence from the Soviet side. The news raced up the Soviet chain of command, bypassing the regular army and going straight to the KGB Residentura in Karlshorst. Here, shock way to cold calculation. The immediate instinct to expose and dismantle the tunnel was suppressed by a more cunning idea. The KGB, led by the ambitious Ivan A., saw an opportunity not just to close a breach, but to orchestrate a devastating propaganda and counterintelligence coup. They would let the tunnel live a little longer. They would use it to feed disinformation, to identify Western intelligence priorities by seeing which lines the Americans were most intently monitoring, and to stage a dramatic, public humiliation of the United States. The discovery was not an end. It was to become the opening act of a carefully scripted performance. For the Americans and British below, the world remained eerily unchanged. The taps were still live. The conversations still flowed. The drip of water continued. They had no electronic indication of a breach. The tunnel's silence, its greatest asset, now became its prison. They were listening, unaware that their listeners had, in turn, found them. They were now actors in a play whose script had been rewritten by the enemy, performing their roles in a theater. The audience was waiting in the wings for the perfect moment to reveal itself. April 22, 1956. April 26, 1956. For 5 days following the accidental discovery, an extraordinary silence descended over the breach site. The Soviet repair crew was withdrawn. A discreet perimeter was established by plainclothes KGB officers, turning the muddy service road into a quiet stage. Below, in the tap chamber, the oscilloscopes continued their green dance. The recordings captured nothing out of the ordinary, no alarmed communications about a tunnel, no urgent engineering dispatches. The Soviet High Command, now fully aware of the wiretap, deliberately maintained normal traffic patterns. This was the first move in their counterplay, to avoid spooking their prey, to buy time for a plan of spectacular exposure. In Washington and London, a faint, unverifiable unease began to creep into the upper echelons of the CIA and MI6. Some officers, particularly Bill Harvey, lived by the rule that no operation lasts forever. The sheer longevity of the tunnel's success was, paradoxically, a source of suspicion. But with tapes still flowing and no positive indication of compromise, the order from the top was to maintain the status quo. The tunnel was too valuable to abandon on a hunch. The machinery of collection ground on, now unwittingly under the observation of its targets. The KGB used this window to plan their theater. They would not simply break into the tunnel from above. That would be crude. Instead, they would stage a dramatic investigation that would lead them to the tunnel's heart, maximizing propaganda value. They prepared press releases, notified trusted East German journalists, and arranged for photographers. The narrative was crafted. Vigilant Soviet and East German troops, conducting routine communications security checks, had uncovered a brazen, illegal espionage act by the Western powers. The tunnel would be portrayed not as an engineering marvel, but as a vulgar invasion of sovereign territory. The performance began in the pre-dawn hours of April 26, 1956. A convoy of Soviet and East German military vehicles, their headlights cutting through the morning fog, converged on the muddy patch above the tunnel. This time, the digging was not for drainage. It was a deliberate excavation, broadcast over loudspeakers and overseen by senior KGB officers in uniform. Jackhammers and shovels tore into the earth, the noise thunderous and deliberate, a stark, violent contrast to the years of silent digging that had created the space below. Inside the tunnel, the sound was apocalyptic. The first vibrations through the soil were felt as a deep, shuddering rumble. Then came the unmistakable, deafening percussion of the jackhammers directly overhead. Dust sifted from the ceiling. The technician on duty in the recording room at Site A heard it first through his headphones, a crashing interference overwhelming the Soviet voice traffic. He ripped the headphones off, the noise now physical in the chamber. The protocol for compromise was immediate and sterile: destroy the tap chamber. He triggered the pre-placed incendiary charges in the ferrite clips and amplifier lines. Small, controlled flames erupted, melting the delicate tap apparatus into useless slag, destroying the evidence of the inductive technology. Then he and the handful of other personnel evacuated back down the tunnel toward the American sector, sealing blast doors behind them. Above, the Soviet diggers broke through. Flashbulbs popped. Cameras rolled as a Soviet officer, wearing a pristine greatcoat, was lowered into the hole. The imagery was perfect for Pravda and the East German newsreels, the heroic defender of socialism descending into the imperialists' lair. They emerged with trophies: American-made technical equipment, coils of wire, tools with English markings. They followed the tunnel back to the heavy steel door marking the border of the American sector. There, for the cameras, they staged a confrontation pounding on the door, demanding entry into the American espionage installation. The public revelation was a global sensation. On April 27th, the Soviet Union held a blistering press conference in East Berlin. They displayed the tunnel's artifacts like trophies of war. They invited Western diplomats and journalists on a carefully guided tour of the tunnel from the Soviet side, painting it as the crime of the century. The propaganda was relentless and effective. In the eyes of the non-aligned world and much of the European public, the United States and Britain looked like reckless aggressors, violating sovereignty and international law. The State Department and the Foreign Office could only issue weak, evasive statements, their credibility damaged. The operational triumph of Project Gold had been transformed overnight into a strategic public relations disaster. The turning point was absolute. It was not merely the end of a collection operation. It was the moment the hidden war became spectacularly public, the moment the hunter was paraded as the villain. The technological masterpiece was now a crime scene, a tourist attraction for Soviet-guided tours. The silence was gone, replaced by the roar of headlines and the click of cameras in the damp, ruined tunnel. The era of listening was over. The era of blame and recrimination had begun. In the days and weeks following the staged exposure of the Berlin Tunnel, the Cold War's battlefield shifted decisively from the shadows to the front pages. The Soviet Union executed its propaganda playbook with flawless precision. The narrative was simple, damning, and visually irresistible. The aggressive NATO powers, unable to compete politically, had resorted to a literal underground invasion of sovereign German territory. East Berlin became the stage for a meticulously managed spectacle. The Soviet military administration organized guided tours for journalists, diplomats, and even curious East Berliners. They led them down the muddy excavation shaft and into the tunnel itself, now brightly lit for the cameras. Soviet guides, speaking in tones of moral outrage mixed with theatrical sarcasm, pointed out the American electrical outlets, the branded equipment, the sophisticated recording apparatus left behind in the retreat. They emphasized the tunnel's path beneath the Soviet War Memorial at Treptower Park, a deliberate insult to the Soviet war dead, they claimed. For the East German press, it was a gift. Headlines screamed of bandit tunnels and American gangster methods. The story dominated the state-controlled airwaves, solidifying the image of the West as a treacherous, disrespectful aggressor. The Western response was crippled by the undeniable truth of the violation. The United States and Britain could not credibly deny the tunnel's existence. Their statements were exercises in strained diplomacy. A U.S. Army spokesman in Berlin offered a terse no comment. The State Department, under pressure, eventually issued a nebulous statement neither confirming nor denying the operation, instead focusing on Soviet propaganda excesses and pointing to the USSR's own history of espionage. It was legally cautious and politically feeble. In the court of global public opinion, particularly in newly independent nations of Asia and Africa wary of Western imperialism, the Soviet narrative won by default. The visual evidence photos of the trench, the tunnel, the American gear was incontrovertible. Diplomatically, the fallout was immediate and severe. The Soviet Union delivered formal, furious protests to the United States, Britain, and France, accusing them of violating the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin and the Potsdam Agreements. They demanded apologies and guarantees against future acts of banditry. While these protests were largely for show, they tied up diplomatic channels and provided the USSR with a potent bargaining chip for future negotiations on Berlin and German reunification. For the West German government under Konrad Adenauer, a staunch ally, the revelation was acutely embarrassing, exposing the extent to which espionage operations were being run from its territory without its formal knowledge, risking its fragile position in divided Berlin. Within the intelligence communities, the exposure triggered a frantic, silent damage assessment. The first and most critical question: when did the Soviets actually know? Analysts pored over the lists of intercepts, looking for any anomaly, any hint that traffic had been subtly manipulated. The suspiciously mundane nature of the traffic right up to the breach now seemed, in retrospect, like a possible indicator of a sophisticated feed operation. Had the last weeks or even months of intelligence been poisoned? The compromise forced an immediate and wholesale reevaluation of every piece of intelligence gleaned from the tunnel. Sources recruited based on tunnel information had to be revalidated. Military assessments of Soviet capabilities had to be scrutinized for possible disinformation. The trust in the source had been absolute. Its betrayal meant every derivative conclusion was now suspect. The human cost for the operatives was one of profound deflation and professional peril. Bill Harvey, the tunnel's volatile father, saw his masterpiece become a global scandal. While he defended the operation's intelligence value fiercely within the CIA, his reputation was permanently tarred by the public debacle. The engineers, technicians, and linguists who had lived the operation for years saw their secret, burdensome work transformed into a public joke and a propaganda to defeat. They were ordered to never speak of it, their expertise now a potential embarrassment. The tunnel, a cathedral of technology and patience, was now a ruin, its purpose stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of a geopolitical scandal. The public spectacle faded, but the private reckoning within the corridors of Langley, MI6, and the Kremlin lasted for years. The central haunting question was one of quality versus quantity. Had the West been the hunter or the hunted? The sheer volume of material from the tunnel ultimately assessed at over 40,000 translated transcripts was undeniable. But the timing of the Soviet discovery forced a bitter reappraisal of its value. Western intelligence agencies embarked on a massive post-mortem analysis. Their conclusion was, and remains, nuanced. For the first 11 months of operation, from May 1955 to April 1956, consensus that the intelligence was almost certainly genuine and of immense value. It had provided an unprecedented, real-time X-ray of the Soviet military bureaucracy in Europe. This period yielded hard, actionable data. the confirmed order of battle, insights into Soviet logistics and morale, and the texture of life within the Eastern Bloc. This was the gold in Project Gold. The doubt centered on the final period. Once the KGB learned of the tunnel from the accidental water leak in late April 1956, they controlled the narrative for the final days before the staged discovery. During this brief window, it is almost certain they used the still live channels to feed carefully crafted disinformation. The goal would not have been to transmit obvious falsehoods that would have been detected, but to subtly exaggerate strengths, minimize weaknesses, and send false signals about Soviet intentions or anxieties. This final trickle of data was poisoned at the source, forcing analysts to quarantine and reevaluate anything from the tunnel's last weeks. The more profound and enduring suspicion was whether the Soviets had known even earlier. This theory, though never proven, became a persistent ghost in Cold War intelligence lore. Some analysts, particularly in MI6, wondered if the entire operation had been compromised from the start by a mole, perhaps even George Blake, the MI6 officer and Soviet double agent who was privy to early planning. Blake was not directly involved in the tunnel's execution, but his general knowledge of Western intelligence activities in Berlin was extensive. While he later claimed he informed the KGB, the Soviet decision to let the tunnel proceed for nearly a year suggests they saw greater value in the intelligence they could gather from it by monitoring what the West was listening to than in shutting it down immediately. The tunnel, in this darkest interpretation, was a magnificent trap, a conduit through which the Soviets could understand Western intelligence priorities and, at a moment of their choosing, deliver a crushing propaganda blow. For the Soviet security apparatus, the aftermath was one of profound, if secret, humiliation followed by strategic adjustment. The initial discovery was a shock that revealed a catastrophic failure in signals security doctrine. The propaganda victory was a necessary public salve for this private wound. Internally, the KGB and GRD, Soviet military intelligence, launched sweeping investigations. Landline security protocols were completely overhauled. New, more sensitive line monitoring equipment was deployed. The very concept of secure, buried cable was abandoned for the most sensitive communications, accelerating investment in more advanced encryption systems and alternative, harder-to-tap transmission methods. The tunnel taught the Soviets a brutal lesson about Western technological audacity, a lesson they would not forget. In the grand chessboard of the Cold War, the tunnel's legacy was paradoxical. Operationally, it was a Western intelligence coup of historic proportions. Strategically, it handed the Soviet Union a powerful propaganda victory and likely advanced the sophistication of their own counterintelligence and deception practices. It demonstrated the limits of technological espionage. Machines could steal secrets, but they could not discern truth from lie if the source was compromised. The operation also cemented the CIA's partnership through shared triumph and shared scandal, binding the two agencies closer in both success and failure. Ultimately, the Berlin Tunnel faded from public memory, overshadowed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, and the Vietnam War. But in the secret world, it remained a foundational case study. It was a monument to human ingenuity and a cautionary tale about the perils of believing your own successes too completely. It proved that the most powerful weapon in espionage is not a tap or a microphone, but control of the narrative. And for 24 hours in April 1956, that control belonged entirely to the men in Karlshorst, who turned an engineering masterpiece into the set for their own triumphant play. The Berlin Tunnel now exists only in archives, declassified memos, and the memories of aging men. The warehouse at Alt-Glienicke is gone. The sandy soil has settled, but as a monument, it was never built of steel or concrete. It was carved from an idea. It represents the absolute zenith of a certain kind of espionage, physical, analog, and audaciously literal. It was the final, grand act of an era where stealing secrets meant moving Earth, not hacking code. In the decades that followed, espionage would ascend into the skies with satellites and retreat into the ether of cyberspace. The Cold War's later battles would be fought with invisible signals and algorithmic warfare. Yet, Project Gold stands as a reminder that the most profound vulnerabilities are often rooted in human assumption. The Soviets trusted the Earth. The Americans trusted their machines to listen. Both were, in their own ways, correct, and both were tragically blind. The tunnel was a collision of these faiths, one shattered by a trenching tool, the other by the realization that secrets, once captured, can carry their own poison. The operation's true legacy lies not in its miles of tape, but in the uncomfortable paradox it bequeathed to the intelligence world. It proved that unparalleled access does not equate to ultimate understanding. It demonstrated that the harder one listens, the more susceptible one becomes to the curated performance. The tunnel was a silent witness, but witnesses can be misled. In the end, the most significant intelligence it provided may have been meta-intelligence, a deep, cautionary lesson about the seduction of one's own cleverness and the perpetual, unknowable question of who is manipulating whom in the dark. It was a cathedral built in a secret place, where priests of technology listened for the heartbeat of an empire. And when the light finally broke in, it revealed not just a tunnel, but the shape of the Cold War itself, a conflict where every triumph contained the seed of a setback, where the ground beneath your feet was never truly solid, and where the most powerful weapon was often simply knowing what the other side was desperate to hear.